Our first speaker against the motion, identity politics is tearing society apart, is Dawn Foster. Dawn, please take to the podium, Guardian columnist who writes on politics, social affairs, and economics, and also a staff writer for Jacobin magazine. Dawn.
So, as some of you might have noticed, I'm a woman. I'm white. I have a disability. And when I think about politics and when I talk about politics, a lot of those identities come into it. So when I think about austerity, I look at how austerity affects certain groups more than others. So in particular, austerity affects women. 82% of all cuts that the government have made impact women. If you look at the pay gap, for instance, women are paid less than men. But if you narrow it down, black women are paid a lot less than other people. So when you think about politics, identity does have to come into it because everybody experiences things differently, personally, but also in terms of economics, in terms of how it affects the community, etc. And when I think about the people, well, when I come across the people who complain about this, it always seems to be exclusively boomers. Sorry. I am closer in age to Kamal's daughter than Kamal. So I am of the generation that is partly interested in identity politics. And I don't think it deflates things. I think people live their life in a normal way. And obviously your identity is part of that. So everything that affects you, everything that makes up the person that is you, including your likes, your hobbies, your dislikes, etc., it all comes together to form a whole person. And I don't think that talking to people and understanding that people have different views, different experiences of life, because of different identities, I don't think it actually deflates things. I don't think it puts people in a box. I think it allows us to be more expansive with policy. I think it allows us to look at political policy and think about how different groups will be affected by it, and therefore stop discrimination within that kind of thing. There is a huge amount of concern about universities, about people being no-platformed, about people not being allowed to speak, etc. And I always find it really, really fascinating that so many people get upset by a small number of students in a student union when almost nobody else will have heard of these small societies, these small groups. And I think the big problem is that we have older people who have columns in big magazines, huge access to the media, constantly saying that they are being silenced. I know this because they write constantly that they are being silenced. They go on TV to talk about the fact that they have been silenced. And, I think if they were, I wouldn't be constantly hearing about them. And I think actually identity politics helps those people because it allows them to constantly place articles in The Spectator, in Spiked magazine, in all sorts of places, talking about the fact that they have been silenced and that identity politics is ruining their life, etc. Thinking about Lionel's speech, I have a lot of friends who are white men, and I don't look at them and think, good Lord, you're so privileged, it's disgusting. Because they are my friends, and I don't think of people, in small, I don't put people in small boxes. I don't look at them as having a tick box on their chest that explains things about them. I think that, for instance, me having a disability changes my life somewhat. I'm in hospital a lot. My friends know that and come and see me. But it doesn't really change anything else. I might need some things like, for instance, if we decide to have strobe lighting here, I wouldn't be able to sit on stage. But that's about it. Don't do that. And I find it really, really fascinating that the big panic comes from older people, a very, very small number of older people who, who as Lionel was saying that the people who are into identity politics are relatively wealthy, tend to be white, etc. But whenever I read articles about people being silenced, about people being kicked out by identity politics, it's always homeowners in their 50s. It's always people who are relatively comfortable, haven't lived through the global financial crash, didn't really affect them. And it seems such an obsession with those people. I've met people who were absolutely desperate to get removed from panels just because they wanted to talk about the backlash that came with it. And they knew that if they were removed from a small panel in Students' Union, they could make a huge amount of money talking about it. Going on the BBC, talking about how they were silenced, writing in The Spectator about how they were silenced. And absolutely nobody at any point thinking, why... Clearly they aren't. Clearly this person's being published everywhere. I think identity politics is actually really, really helpful in terms of making sure that we think more deeply about how policy affects people, about how we can stop kind of gaps in admissions to university, how we can stop people being paid less, how we can look at the fact that if you are disabled, you are less likely to get a job, and how we can change things to bring other people in. And I think that we have to move past the terrifying fear that a lot of boomers have around this. People. When I look at my friends, I don't have a tick box in my head that appears like some kind of sci-fi thing that breaks down what they are and who they are. We might have conversations about so I was having a conversation with my friend the other day about the fact that they had been the victim of a homophobic attack. But identity doesn't always come up, and sometimes it does. And I think it's a lot more useful to talk about it and think about how discrimination happens and how we can stop that from happening. One really, really key bit, I think, David will talk about this, is university admissions. So, for instance, Oxford, had a huge race problem. They have a huge class problem, and bringing that up and talking about it means that they will actually take some action and think about that. There have been some court cases where people have looked at the fact that certain policies are bound to affect women, therefore they are discriminatory. Other policies, for instance, like exclusively seem to hit disabled people, and those people have gone to court and talked about the fact they've been discriminated against, and often won the cases and changed the policy. So I think that if we want to have a more equal society, there is no way we can do that without thinking about identity, without thinking about how certain things mean that other people find it harder to get into certain jobs, find it harder to reach certain things, or even come into a building because there isn't a wheelchair ramp. So I think that identity politics is not about deciding who is the villain, who is the most privileged, who we should never ever talk about and attack and talk about their privilege. I think it's much more about making sure that our society is more welcoming to people and that political policy doesn't discriminate against individuals and big groups. It does at the moment. Austerity massively affects women, and it massively, if you are a woman and you are disabled, you're doubly discriminated against by certain policies. That is identity politics, and I think we need to remember that if we are making policy, it needs to be more equal. It needs to make sure that, for instance, if you are a young black person and you're applying for a certain job, or a place in the university, you aren't discriminated against by the way that the interview takes place. And so I think identity politics is about equality. It's about making sure that everybody has the same access, and that access might be slightly different based on their identity. And I think that it's led to a lot of people thinking more deeply about how they act and how society should be built. So I I'm against the motion. I think that we should be more equal, and I think that identity politics is key to that. We can't move past identity. We can't ignore identity. And I think that maybe at some point the boomers will understand that.